All right, and we're back. Welcome to another episode of The More You Know. And I know that the schedule's kind of been wonky, kind of been uploading when I feel like it, but some days, I just started school, so it's still trying to find that balance and that schedule with like work, life, gym, and all that. But without further ado, our guest today is Dr. Joe Meyer, and we are going to be talking about a topic that kind of talks about how we interact today, which is very interesting. Something that I have heard about, but I've never dived deeper into. So, Dr. Joe, can you give us a brief intro of yourself?
Sure, and thank you, Brian, for having me on. I received my PhD in early American literature, studying mostly what we would call the American Renaissance period, authors like Herman Melville, Edgar Allan Poe, Emily Dickinson, Hawthorne, that kind of a thing, and how they often used the Bible as a major source of their kind of influence or as their muse, if you will. And I've also published articles on the heroic narrative in literature, how it's sculpted and how it affects its environment at the time that it was written. These pieces were written, and I'm currently doing research on the how historical movements, major historical movements, that is, how they affect the way that we interact with each other on a cultural level.
Very interesting, very interesting. And I know that when we were talking before, you did mention the concept of postmodernism. Can you give a brief like explanation of what that really is and how that really pertains to how people interact with each other today?
Sure. So, really quickly, let me do just a little bit of back work here. Historical movements, the major ones at least, things like the Enlightenment, Romanticism, Modernism, and then you get postmodernism and what I'm calling our movement today, and what others call it as well. I didn't make up the term, is neomodernism. What you have to understand about historical movements is they essentially function like rubber bands. The further or the more that we're in the movement, the more we pull back that rubber band, and the more kind of potential energy we build up in them until eventually we reach a certain point where it just snaps. And just like a rubber band, when it snaps, usually it happens with like a force to it, right? And almost, dare we even say, a kind of violence, even as well. So I say that because our current cultural movement, neo-modernism, is a kind of snapback from what postmodernism was. So, postmodernism is by its very nature difficult to identify because it wants to be. That's why oftentimes when people say, I think I'm going to look up what postmodernism really is, for the most part, it kind of looks like gobbledygook,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, I can
Yeah.
attest to that because
Yeah,
when I tried looking it up, it made no sense to me. So I just tried to
absolutely.
make my own definition of like based on what I was looking at.
And you know what? What's funny about that, Brian, is that's very postmodern of you to do to make up your own definition. And I'm only half joking because the thing about postmodernism, and let me say this too, it's very popular today to hear people just absolutely hate postmodernism and say, "Oh, all the problems we have today is because of postmodernism." Well, okay, let's temper that for a moment. And maybe by the end of this episode, we'll have maybe a more balanced view of it. At its heart, postmodernism can be defined by one word: skepticism. It's essentially skeptical of anything that tries to create a definition of something. More specifically, it really is skeptical of any grand narratives or meta narratives, right? So things like religion, for example, it's skeptical of religions because they oftentimes try to provide us with a very concrete definition of what is good, what is evil, what's right, what's wrong, what's the way to live, and what isn't. And so postmodernism looks upon those kind of narratives with a skeptical eye and, dare I say, even tries to move those dominant narratives to the side to see if we can make room for something else to emerge instead. So here's the good, for example, of postmodernism. You don't get the civil rights movement, the way that it happened in the 1960s, especially how successful it was in America, you don't get that without postmodernism. Because postmodernism looked at the dominant cultural narrative of America and said, we're skeptical of the way that that looks in just one direction. And so it said, let's destabilize that narrative enough so that we can have other citizens, other people take part fully in the American life. And so out of postmodernism, you get shows like I Love Lucy. You get Nat King Cole, who's the first African American to host his own, television show. That all comes out of a postmodern view that we want to be skeptical of anything that says this is the way it should be.
So, an example. So, would this tie into kind of like modern today about people talking about vaccines and how a lot of people are kind of skeptical on it, and how you have one side saying that it's the way to go, then the other side that they're skeptical of it? Is this a valid way of kind of like explaining postmodernism?
Well, I would say the difficult and kind of disjointed discussions that we're having today around COVID-19 protocols and vaccines and all of this stuff, that is, in my opinion, that's a neo modern problem that is trying to deal with kind of the wake of postmodernism. Again, think about it. So it's not as if when a historical movement ends, it goes away completely. We have enlightened thinkers today. We have romantic heroes today. We have very modern people today as well in literature. So you never get rid of a historical movement or the traits of a historical movement completely. It's all the more kind of evident when you're in the first, let's say, couple of years or even a decade of a new historical movement. So I would say the reason why we're having these disjointed discussions is because postmodernism, especially toward the end of itself in the late 90s, early 2000s, destabilized narratives so much that we could no longer look to anything for a kind of truth. And so what happens? Well, when how you ask yourself this question, how long can your average human being live in pure chaos, pure destabilization before they're going to say, if I can't find truth somewhere else, I'm going to just make it on my own. And so everyone is looking to create their own kind of truth to find a narrative reassurance. And because of that, you're getting a very disjointed discussion going on here
Hmm.
today.
That makes sense. The, so, does this lead us into neo modernism then?
Yeah, and well, yeah, I'll say it this way too. Leading into neo-modernism, you end up with some major problems at the tail end of postmodernism that were clear signals of basically its coming demise. So for example, I'll use this sometimes in class. I'll show a clip from Family Guy, which I mean I laugh at Family Guy. I think it's hysterical. But there are certain things that happen in that show that if we stop and actually think about what's going on, become a bit uncomfortable. And I'll just give you one example. Are you familiar with the show Family Guy?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Okay. So you know the character Herbert?
yeah.
Okay. So if you watch the show, you know that Herbert has a nickname, and it's Herbert the Pervert.
Hmm.
And there's one scene in an episode where he's kind of tucking in Chris, the young man of the
Ugh,
family.
ugh.
There, oh, there you go. So you know already. Now, I won't get too deep into it because, I just probably not a good idea, but the scene where he's tucking in this young man, Chris, we as the audience, we know that what we're watching is wrong. Like
But
something's happening here. Go ahead. What were we going to
but
say?
I feel like that happens with a lot of adults when they kind of reflect back at like their childhood TV shows even. I feel like a lot of people even look back at SpongeBob and they look back and they say that's a lot of like innuendos that we didn't really catch up on when we were kids, but now that we're older we noticed that what they kind of did was kind of inappropriate. Is that because like we have is it well, one, is it because people have dirty minds, or is it just like something that's like built in?
Well, it's a good question. So you bring up the idea of innuendo. Innuendo requires wit, and that's probably the most accurate word we can use there. Is it requires wit. In other words, it's a word play where the audience understands that something else is being communicated, right? Other than the literal intention. The issue with the scene with in Family Guy is that we have knowledge as to the type of person that Herbert is. And the whole time we're laughing, but it's of course it's an uncomfortable laugh. Now, think about this for a second. If we were to talk about Herbert outside of the context of the show, we wouldn't be laughing, right? Because Herbert likes young men, he likes boys.
Hmm.
We would not be laughing. Yet, what postmodernism has done, postmodernism creates a space from which we've destabilized certain things so much that it actually can get us to laugh at that situation. Not, and this is not to be meant to make people feel judged about laughing. I always have to tell even my students, I say that's not the point. My point is simply to point out that historical movements are so strong in this particular one, in postmodernism, it has allowed us or given us the space to laugh at something that we normally would never consider laughing at. And I only use that example to say, okay, that's how far we've destabilized to a degree. What would be further than that? No idea. And so you have the snapback of the rubber band. We enter neo-modernism, and what are we looking for? We want stabilization. We want narrative reassurance. And that comes with its own set of positives and negatives.
So when you say that, like in that scene in Family Guy where people kind of laugh at like situations that aren't supposed to be funny but are funny in that context, do you think stand-up comedians have also taken a like do you think stand-up comedians are the first ones to kind of take this into consideration? Because I know that a few stand-up comedians that I've watched
Mm-hmm.
before, they can make some uncomfortable jokes that are not really let's just say PG for
Mm-hmm.
today's audience, but people still laugh at it.
Absolutely. And well, think about it this way. Stand-up comedy comes into its own. It really emerges in postmodernism
That's what it
because
sounds like.
absolutely it's a postmodern art. And that's why their entire goal, the best stand-up comedians are the ones who basically tell you don't even come in here if you're going to protect a specific sacred space that you have. My whole job is going to be to put skepticism to all areas of life and invite skepticism to it. And I'm going to destabilize all of the narratives that I have in front of us. So their entire job is to do that. Have you ever been to a comedy club or seen a stand-up show where it's not funny? Like they're just not good. One of the reasons why it's not good, and next time this happens, take note of it, is because all they do is they build up the intensity of the moment, but they never actually release it with laughter.
Oh, that's
That's the
weird.
problem.
That's
That's the
awkward.
absolutely. That's the reason why people bomb in stand-up comedy is because they create that intensity in the audience and the audience desperately wants that tension to be released. And if you can't do it with laughter, how does it come out from the audience?
Oh man.
Booze.
Oh man. Just building it up and just everyone, and then they're waiting for the punchline of the joke and they never get it and then they just walk out of there feeling uncomfortable. Oh,
Yeah,
I
and
couldn't
how many
imagine.
times do we think about like great stand-up comics to a degree also have quite a bit of philosophy to them, right? They'll say something that's really prescient to the times or really important to the times. Well, what are they doing? They're destabilizing our spaces. They're doing a postmodern thing. So in some ways, we'll always have again postmodernism with us. And I would argue that if you're one of the people who's been told constantly to just hate postmodernism, well then you better hate stand-up comedy because that's a postmodern art that we're definitely going to want to keep with us.
Gotcha. And then moving on from postmodernism into neo-modernism, how would you best describe that? And like, what are some examples that people are people are adopting today to kind of represent that?
Sure. So I see, at least thus far in my research, I see three major traits emerging in neo modernism. The first one I already kind of touched upon, and that's narrative reassurance, where everything's been so destabilized. We're like, look, I need some kind of narrative to believe in. The second one is this idea of looking to transcend the body. And all I mean by that is looking in some ways to be more than just our mortal form. So, for example, you can't go more than a half an hour without hearing somebody talk about meditation, the importance of meditation, or reading something about psychedelic usage. Right? We're all about using psychedelics today to try to help with mental health. Well, it's not as if that hadn't already been around. I mean, using psychedelics for mental health has been around, you could argue, for thousands of years. And if you want to get a little bit closer to us, there was a huge movement in the 1960s to try to use psychedelics as a way of, let's say, improving or helping us kind of achieve a kind of mental health balance. So why is it that it has reemerged so much today? I would argue because we're trying to transcend just our normal form and trying to find something to become or some way to become greater than our mortality. The last trait that I see is this yearning to try to create personal sacred spaces. And that stems from the example I just gave before, where in the latter parts of postmodernism, everything became fair game for mockery to the point that I think people started to look around and started saying, well, can't I have anything in my life that's just for me, that's just sacred to me, that I could kind of connect to and say, I don't want you to necessarily mock that part of me. So, those I would say are the top three of the major traits that I'm seeing in neo modernism. And I think the first and major way that it's showing itself is the emergence of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, quite honestly. Uh, the emergence of the superhero story, which starts roughly in the you can make the argument the mid 90s with the X-Men and Batman cartoons and Superman, and then going into the X-Men movies. You have the Marvel Cinematic Universe in 2008, and the thing that they did that was so smart is Marvel read the room perfectly. It wasn't I'm not saying that they knew we were heading into a new movement, but I think they could feel that the need for complex narratives had pretty much died down because the stories of Tony Stark, of Iron Man, and of Captain America, if you really look at them, they break down to just basic good versus evil and right and wrong. That is not postmodern. Postmodern wants complexity. Remember, it wants to be skeptical of things like good and evil.
But kind of like going back and like in what you were talking about in the beginning of neo modernism and how everyone wants to transcend the body into something else. There is kind of one thing that I've been seeing a lot with people on my social media feeds. There's a lot of people more really into their consciousness, the meditation, stones, and all of that. How exactly did this concept of like meditation, um, and just being all conscious really come in?
Well, I would say it connects again to that the idea of narrative problems. We take for granted how important it is for us to build a narrative around our lives. It's very important. As a matter of fact, there there are very strong reasons, good reasons, why we've been writing in things like journals and diaries for, I mean, you could go back thousands of years, really. It's because when you're writing these daily kind of things, you're providing yourself with narrative. And at the same time, you're providing yourself with focus, and you're providing yourself with a kind of vision, even of the future to a degree. By making sense of the past and making sense of your present, you're giving yourself a way to think about the future. And when postmodernism destabilized that and sort of said, well, you know what, you can, since there is no true concept of, let's say, good and evil, when it did that, destabilized it, it destabilized a kind of method to envision one's future going forward. And once neo-modernism came around and we started thinking about, I'd kind of like a good narrative again for myself, well, now you have another problem. The problem being, what is your narrative? And just how far do you want to take that narrative? And I would say that meditation, psychedelics, even prayer, and all that stuff, the stones and things like that, are ways that people are trying to focus their minds enough to build a coherent narrative.
I can definitely see that. I can definitely see that because I have a close friend who got really absorbed into that type of stuff, and just hearing him talk sometimes is very insightful, and very it's just like a big change from like what I was used to, like seeing from like a different version of themselves to now. It's very fascinating to see how they think and like how I don't know, just like the sources online now that can kind of lead you to kind of building a whole different narrative from like what every different from what everyone else is seeing is very fascinating to me.
Well, let me ask you this then, Brian, too, right? To kind of piggyback off of that. Do you see, and this has nothing to do, because I don't want you to say something about a friend of yours, obviously, but like, do you see a potential problem with this moving forward, right? Because again, these historical movements are really like rubber bands. You can only stretch them so far before they just kind of snap. And this one here of neo-modernism will eventually snap at some point. Can you already see the potential problem even in just what you said? While one part of it is good, there's another issue here too, right?
Hmm.
Like, do you see, like, even in what you said about how everyone's trying to find their own?
Um, I mean, I don't see it being bad. Um, like whatever works. I go with like the concept of like whatever works for you works for you. If it makes you happy, then yeah, go at it. But the point where you try to push it on me and force me to convert to that way, then we have a problem here. That's one thing, because like one thing's like I just think everyone should keep an open mind to things, and that's what I try to do with everything, even if it like opposes my views or anything. I try to keep an open mind to see their point of view. But when you try to like push it on me, persuade me, tell me that I'm wrong and that this and this and this is what I've done my research on and what I've read proves this and that, then that's kind of like where I kind of have an issue with it, because I'm trying to keep an open mind with you. I'm listening to what you're saying, but I am my own human being, and then I feel like I should be able to make my own choice of like what I believe. But it just is kind of seeing the boundaries of like just recognizing boundaries as when people step over boundaries or kind of don't create one for themselves, and that I think will become a big problem with it. But
Yeah.
as of right now, if they keep it to themselves, they just post it and they don't try to like force it on people, I don't see a problem with that. But maybe down the road, it can like something might come up and it might be a bigger issue leading us into another era of modernism.
Well, yeah, it's you said it there like kind of perfectly. Even in the way you framed it as kind of boundaries, right? And that's sort of what I mean when I say that people are trying to create their own personal sacred space. And you're very clear about the idea that, look, I have my approach, my way of doing things that is for me. And I respect the fact that you, meaning like others, have your own kind of way, approach of having your own sacred space, your own way to build your narrative. But when you try to invade mine and tell me that I need to do it your way, that's when I start to have a problem. And that's on the surface, that seems like a very, intuitive statement, right? Like you could picture that coming up in any point in history, essentially. However, I would argue that neo-modernism coming out of postmodernism and that destabilization, that's why we are seeing such contentious arguments happening in culture today, is because it's so important for us to build that stabilized narrative as soon as possible, because I think we feel it as human beings that we need it. And so when someone comes in and tries to destabilize what we're trying to build, we don't just take it as like a small kind of, inconvenience. We take it as almost an attack on the soul in a sense. It's
Yeah.
very important to us. Like, no, go over there and go do your thing. I am trying to build mine. And you had, I thought you expressed that quite, you articulated it quite well in the way that you said it. But you can see, I guess, yeah, as just as you said also, I'll just end that with this note. You can see how by the end of neo-modernism, whenever that is, and I have no idea when that is, but you can see at least one potential downfall is that we create our own personal spaces and live by them so much that we have very few things that are going to connect us to each other. And we become really um, defensive about our spaces. And that's not a good thing, actually, to become too defensive, because as a human being, we always need to be challenged in some ways so that we can grow and incorporate new ideas.
I agree. I mean, I think that like if people encroach your space of thinking, encroach your way of anything, I think it's good for you to debate them. But I think there's a good line of like where this debate needs to end, where the debate needs to stop. I think debate is healthy. I think it just like in the tech space, like the more competitors that we have in tech, the greater it is because it's going to be able to innovate better. But it's just that I just feel like there's a very fine line where people can debate, but once you cross over a certain point, that's when it gets hostile, and that's what we don't want.
I couldn't agree more. I could not have said it better myself. And I think if more people would clearly identify in their own minds, dare I say, even add it to their own narrative if it helps, where that line is for them, it will actually help things because then you can see if someone, especially if it's someone you care about, if someone is starting to come close to that line for you, you can start to redirect them a little bit somewhere else, as opposed to, and I mean, you can tell me if this has ever happened to you. There have been times when I've been talking to people, and about halfway through the conversation, I realize, oh, wait, this is a debate. Oh boy, okay, yeah, and I think I'm losing. Oh no. Like, I won't even know that I'm in a debate because I just went in thinking that we're just going to have a conversation about something. But if you have that line built in, you can redirect. And then at the same time, when we're having healthy dialogues, we shouldn't even necessarily have to enter into a debate as much as we should just have conversations. And then that way, when we're done, we could say, hey, you want to just go, grab a bite to eat?
Hmm.
I mean, that's
Yeah,
really where we want to go.
yeah, and I think that's just kind of like built into humans in general, is that people just hate losing in general, or like people just hate being wrong. But I think it's good that if people have that built-in little like that built-in like little line where you just notice like, oh, this person's actually trying to say that all my stuff is wrong, what I think is not true, and that their way is the best. And then that's mm, it, it's good to have that signal in your head that can kind of like shift you from like pointing the conversation into another direction. And I do have a friend that does do this a lot, and like I know him enough where I'm able to kind of shift the conversation from this debated topic where um he's very adamant on one side, I'm very adamant on the other side, and I hear him out, but it's just something that's like if someone's sold on something, you're not going to change their mind, but I will listen to you. But there's just there's just a fine line of like how much I can listen to.
Yeah, because again, you have a right, and I would say even an urgent need to build up your own kind of narrative to stabilize who you are. And more importantly, I encourage people, just like I encourage even my students, start building up templates in terms of who do you want to be? Like, it's something that we take this for granted. Just how, like, I'll ask students sometimes, and I haven't asked them yet this semester, but I will. Sometimes I'll just ask them randomly, do you think you're a good person? Or I'll say, are you a good person? I'll be very direct. And of course, the first student will look at me and kind of go, like, kind of smile because they're like, I have no idea what to say. I don't know if this is a trick. And I'm like, no, no, it's not a trick. It's not a trick. Are you a good person? Then I'll ask the second person. And the second person will usually be kind of mousy about it. And he or she might say, I, I'd like to think so. And then I'll usually ask a third person. And the third person is usually the one who's like, I'm just going to say yes. Yes. And I'm like, okay, good. So then I'll ask that third person who says yes, how do you know? And then they kind of look at me like, oh,
Oh,
uh.
what did I get myself into?
And my whole point to them is when there's no way for you to really know if you're a good person or not if you haven't already done the reflection that's required to create the criteria for what a good person is. And if we don't have that criteria built into us, constantly ready to draw upon, then how can you truly know if what you're doing or the trajectory of your life, where it is as a human being, how can you possibly know if you're on a good path for yourself or not?
Yeah.
I mean, so I encourage people, even people in the audience who are listening, even just a 15-minute session, write down what is a good person to you and think about that because then I think we never think about how much clarity we get and how much mental health. You had that great episode with Jeremy where you talked about mental health, and that's so important because the more you can have these kind of templates handy to you, like what is a good person to me, the easier it becomes to spot these situations that bring anxiety to us, where we go, you know what? That's not going to lead me to being the best version of myself. I'm not going to like who I am after I do this. So I'm just going to politely decline. Oh, the amount of solace and calmness that you get from kind of knowing that this is not going to be good for me, so I'm going to just decline. I can't tell you that kind of calmness that comes. It's wonderful. And yet, I'll just add this one thing. Nietzsche, I think it was, in On Truth and Lying in a Non-Moral Sense, I think he said he has this great metaphor where he says like your values and things should be like a spider's web. And the reason why he said that is because think of what a spider web actually holds. It doesn't just hold the weight of the spider, right? It holds really an immense amount of weight. It's a fascinating structure that can hold so many things. And yet, what happens when a decent breeze comes along? Whew, just wisps it right away. You want your templates to be a little bit like that. Really strong, can withstand the weight of you and others, and yet if you need to adjust them, you should feel like you can.
The first thing that really comes to mind when you say like kind of making like a checklist of like what kind of people you want to interact with kind of brings me to that saying of like you are the definition of like the five people that you hang around the most. And I think a lot of people struggle with this, I feel like, is because they have that constant thought of FOMO. So like I feel like this is very prevalent in college where people are like they have friends like a really like they have a group of like tight knit friends which kind of share the same values, but then they also have that other set of friends where all their values don't line up with yours, but when you go out with them and when you hang out with them, they they have a good side of them. Well, that you just have fun with them. I don't know. It's kind of hard to explain, but like, it's just I feel like if people cut off like a certain people that don't line up to their values, but there's a fun side that they have with them, it kind of creates a feeling of FOMO or fear of missing out whenever they're not with them, or if they get invited to something and they uh, decline.
No, you're absolutely right. And here that's why I added and I'll clarify it, why I added the importance of being able to like whisk away these things a little bit. Because at the same time, you can see how a person could create a template made out of stone. And because they have everything just kind of chiseled out, it cannot be changed, they will actually miss out on a tremendous amount of beauty and wonder and challenge that's built into the human experience. So, this is not something that you create and then you keep always. The beauty of it is that you hold on to it to try to make sure you stay in a very broad center lane so that you can be challenged and try something new. And I encourage, it's funny, what I'm seeing so far in my students this semester, normally in the past when I taught, previous generations, you would tell them every so often you'd say stay in your dorm and do just a little bit of research, a little bit of study, and you'll see how much that helps you out in the future. But actually what I find myself screaming to my students these days is get out of your dorm.
Yeah.
You've got to get out there. You have to challenge yourself to experience the human condition. I mean, you have to. I am very worried about that, especially students coming in with the pandemic surroundings and the isolation possibility of it. I am constantly telling them, get out, go do something, go be safe at a party, go, hang out somewhere with people, with friends. And if you need to, you know, do your homework the next morning, then do it then. But you can't just stay in your dorm and you can't be so rigid that you prevent yourself from experiencing life and from continually growing.
Yeah, it like just kind of piggybacking off of that, it's just very sad to see like summers now where like you don't really see kids outside anymore. I mean, I think it's really sad because when I was a kid, like I would be riding my bike every single day. Like I would ride my bike past people's houses and there's just like a lawn filled with bikes just tipped over because everyone's just hanging out there or just or like I don't see kids at the park anymore. I know that I used to play tag around this big apartment complex and I don't even see any of that. And I think it's very sad to see that like and I think it has to do a lot with like technology and just like having kids stuck on their phones and also video games too. But it's just very sad to see in this modern age that there's not a lot of kids really being active. And once you enter college, then yeah, that's a different story. But just the kids like before that is just very sad to see.
Yeah, and there's also something to be said for the anxiety of parenting today, where maybe parents are trying so hard because they love their children. They're trying so hard to make sure that they have every opportunity to be successful in whatever they do. They'll take them from place to place to place to place. And in some ways, we're devaluing that creativity that comes from just kicking the kid outside. Like, go,
Hmm.
go, just go. Oh, well, what should I do? Whatever. Just be safe. Go do
Hmm.
it, right? Because that prompted us always to start to make up our own games and to think about, like, okay, well, maybe I'll go check this thing out here, or I'll go look at that. You create inquiry, and that's something that is sorely lacking today. Inquiry, let's, be clear, being curious, that's the number one thing that is going to dictate your experience in college. I mean, you can have great professors and they're wonderful, but if you're not in some way curious about something, then college is going to seem much more like a labor than it should.
That's a fact. I can definitely see that. It's good to keep a curious mind.
Absolutely.
And like the listeners who are listening to like are listening to this episode, I hope that Dr. Joe, like I hope he brought something that made you curious about either postmodernism, neo-modernism, or like anything that we talked about in this episode. I hope it got you curious about something in it. And after this episode, you either reach out to Dr. Joe or you just research this topic more. And I think the more you know, no pun intended, but the more you know in life, the more like curious you will be, more I don't know, it just kind of I feel like it builds who you are. It makes you more interesting.
Yeah.
maybe 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 that's just a bad way to put it, but that's kind of how I feel about like just knowing a lot of information and just being curious on some things. But to kind of wrap this up, I wanted to get your thoughts on like what do you think is in the future? What do you think is going to be post neo modernism? Like, what do you think is going to happen?
That is a fantastic question.
Again,
Um,
no facts,
yes, I
just
have
like,
no
just
facts.
like
So,
I was saying, no facts, just kind of your opinions on like what you
okay.
think.
We'll see. We'll see in 20, 30 years or whatever it is when this ends, how much of this actually pans out. But I will actually make a kind of proclamation here that I think might happen. So we're continuing, I think we're going to continue to look for narrative stability, and we're going to continue to try to transcend the body and try to create this kind of sacred space. What I think is going to happen is I think postmodernism was kind of the precipice or the top of a cycle of these historical movements. Neo-modernism has a lot of traits of modernism, which is the one that preceded postmodernism, of course. I think what we might end up going into after this is neo-romanticism. Romanticism was about a lot of emotion and nature, and again, trying to find a kind of value that was beyond just the mortal form, beyond just thinking. Because, really quickly, Romanticism was a reaction to the Enlightenment, which said the height of the human being, the human experience, was done through thinking, heavy thought, right? Rationale. And so Romanticism says I can't just be a human thinking. I need to feel something. So you had a lot of emotion in Romanticism. I think we're heading into Neo Romanticism after this. Heavy emotion, heavily looking at probably religions, heavily looking at a a system, a systematic belief in something greater than us.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting. I can definitely see that happening. I definitely see that. See some people already jumping the gun on this that I see
Could
on
be. Could.
social media. So maybe they're really early on it. Maybe it'll become something of the future. Definitely a very interesting concept to look into and just kind of think about. And I kind of encourage people who listen to this to kind of think about like what everything Dr. Joe talked about in this episode and kind of think deeply more about what we talked about, what kind of played into postmodernism and how it led to neo-modernism, and kind of just think to yourself, what is like when is that rubber band going to snap on neo-modernism, and what is it going to lead into? And it's just a very interesting concept to think about too, because like if you think about it now and you kind of start implementing about like how it could change your thoughts on a couple things. So it's definitely a very good topic to think about and kind of look more into. And yeah, and that's all that I have for you. Thanks so much for joining me on the show. Like, where can my listeners find you?
Sure, and thank you, Brian. I have my own podcast called the Neutral Ground Podcast. You can find it on Spotify, Apple, Google, all those places. You can also go to the neutralgroundpodcast.com, where you can learn a little bit about me and check out what the show is about. Essentially, it's a place to have meaningful conversations about the human experience without extreme noise, extreme takes, and any sort of divisive kind of talk.
Awesome, awesome, and everything and his podcast website, anything that he wants to link also will be in it will be in the description of this podcast. Dr. Joe, if you have anything like articles or anything that you also want to link my listeners to kind of get a better picture of everything, please send it over. I have a website called podcast.com, and that's where listeners can go to if they want to visit the link dump if they want to kind of like learn more about the topic and just kind of have some articles handy that the guest sends along that can be helpful for them. But once again, thanks so much for coming on the show. I've had a amazing time talking with you. I've definitely learned a lot, and this is definitely something that has got me curious now, and that is kind of getting me thinking about like the future of like how we think and like what we do.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Brian, for having me on. I really appreciate it.
All right, and that's a wrap. I hope you enjoyed this show of The More You Know. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating this podcast on Apple Podcasts. It'll certainly help me out in the algorithm, and be sure to subscribe or follow to The More You Know on your favorite podcasting platform like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Google Podcasts, or any of your favorite podcasting apps. And lastly, if you would like to contribute to The More You Know, you can head over to anchor.fm// The More You Know Pod and contribute any monetary value to help the quality of the show, and in the future bring on some more interesting guests. Thank you so much, guys. I appreciate all of my listeners, and I hope you guys have a wonderful week.